What's your favorite ancient mythology story? Prometheus, who loved his weak little humans so much that he tricked Zeus to keep them alive and subsequently spent thousands of years dying each day just to save them, loves you more than your mom does. I like it too for another coincidence. According to the myth, a bird eats Prometheus' liver which regenerates each day. We know for a fact today that liver is the only organ that can regenerate. The myth of Tantalus is always a good one. He was an early king of Lydia who essentially wanted to test the omniscience of the gods, so he invited them over for a feast and served up his son Pelops. You know, cut him up and boiled him like any loving father would. Well, turns out the gods were pretty dang omniscient and knew what he'd done, except for Demeter, who was mourning for her daughter Persephone. He absent-mindedly ate Pelops' shoulder, so when the gods eventually got around to reassembling the boy, they had to make him a new one of ivory. For his impudence, Tantalus was eternally punished. He stood in a swampy lake where the water reached his chin, but would soak down into the mud whenever he tried to drink it. Above him was a tree drooping with the most delicious and ripest fruits, but whenever he tried to pull them down, a gust of wind would blow them away into the shadowing clouds. He could never satisfy his hunger or thirst, as it was always just out of his reach. From Tantalus' punishment comes the modern word tantalize. Thrimskvitha. Thor and Loki get wasted and black out. They wake up to find that the giants have nicked Thor's hammer while he was passed out. They hatch a plan to persuade the beautiful Freya to marry the leader of the giants, effectively trading her for the hammer. Freya laughs in their faces and tells them where to go. She's having none of it. So of course the only solution is for Thor to dress up as Freya and present himself as the giant's prospective bride. The giants are so stupid that they'll never know the difference, right? The scheme actually goes fairly well, right up until the wedding feast when Thor gets a bit carried away and eats a whole roast ox, drinks a whole barrel of mead and generally looks like a ferocious guy in a dress. There's a brilliant Red Riding Hood style bit in the original text where the giant sidles up so Loki and says Freya has just eaten a whole ox, what's up with that? And Loki replies well, she's been so very nervous about her marriage to you that she hasn't been able to eat a thing for days. She's just excited. The bride's eyes seem to shine with the rage of 1,000 suns. Loki, what's that all about rage? Oh, that's not rage. That's the love that she feels for you burning wildly in her eyes. It is her passion and joy at the thought of marrying you and so on. Of course Thor eventually gets his hands on his hammer again, throws off his veil and murders all the giants before laughing all the way home, but all good myths should have a crapload of bloodshed in them, I think. I'm never going to read a better description of this myth. Fenrir. Fenris in Norse mythology. Fenrir, or Fenris, is a gigantic and terrible monster in the shape of a wolf. He is the eldest child of Loki and the giantess Angrboda. The gods learned of a prophecy which stated that the wolf and his family would one day be responsible for the destruction of the world. They caught the wolf and locked him in a cage. Only the god of war, Tyr, dared to feed and take care of the wolf. When he was still a pup they had nothing to fear, but when the gods saw one day how he had grown, they decided to render him harmless. However, none of the gods had enough courage to face the gigantic wolf. Instead, they tried to trick him. They said the wolf was weak and could never break free when he was chained. Fenrir accepted the challenge and let the gods chain him. Unfortunately, he was so immensely strong that he managed to break the strongest fetters as if they were cobwebs. After that, the gods saw only one alternative left, a magic chain. They ordered the dwarfs to make something so strong that it could hold the wolf. The result was a soft, thin ribbon, Gleipnir. It was incredibly strong, despite what its size and appearance might suggest. The ribbon was fashioned of 6 strange elements: the footstep of a cat, the roots of a mountain, a woman's beard, the breath of fishes, the sinews of a bear, and a bird's spittle. The gods tried to trick the wolf again, only this time Fenrir was less eager to show his strength. He saw how thin the chain was, and said that was no pride in breaking such a weak chain. Eventually, though, he agreed, thinking that otherwise his strength and courage would be doubted. Suspecting treachery, however, he in turn asked the gods for a token of goodwill. One of them had to put a hand between his jaws. The gods were not overly eager to do this, knowing what they could expect. Finally, only Tyr agreed, and the gods chained the Wolf with Gleipnir. No matter how hard Fenrir struggled, he could not break free from this thin ribbon. In revenge, he bit off his hand. Being very pleased with themselves, the gods carried Fenrir off and chained him to a rock called Gile, a mile down into the earth. They put a sword between his jaws to prevent him from biting. On the day of Ragnarok, Fenrir will break his chains and join the giants in their battle against the gods. He will seek out Odin and devour him. Vidar, Odin's son, will avenge his father by killing the wolf. The Egyptian myth of creation. Before all the censorship, it begins with Ra, the only currently existing thing, who got so lonely he jacked the universe out of his balls. Skip a few parts, then we get the sky goddess Nut and earth god Geb, whose sex could be so violently wild that Ra had to separate them. They managed to have 5 children, one of whom was born on a special day created with moonlight won through gambling. Anyway, the 5 were a bit incestuous, so they married each other. Thoth ended up alone and isn't important to this story. Set married Nephthys, who was not nearly as hot as Osiris's wife, Isis. He trapped Osiris in a casket by a casket measuring contest and threw him into a river, which carried him out to sea and ended up being a tree. Isis finds him, sees him in a sort of unshakable stupor, and so fellets him until he recovers. They go back, where they meet Set, who rips Osiris into 14 pieces and throws them in another river. The dong piece is eaten by a fish. Isis finds these and recreates Osiris, substituting a gold member for the lost one, and revives him. The revival is short-lived, so they frick and Isis gets pregnant with Horus, who would avenge his father. Horus and Set meet up much later to see who was more Ahem dominant. As Set was about to come, Isis teleported Horus away. Then, I'm quoting accurately here, using the magic of her hands, causes Horus to come, which she catches in a jar, which a disguised Horus used as salad dressing for Set's next dinner. By the laws of the gods, Horus wins. I'm a big fan of the downfall of Kronos, king of the Titans. He feared that he would be overthrown by his own children, as Kronos did with his own father Uranus. So as they were born, he ate them. But his wife, Rhea, tricked him when Zeus was born, giving him a rock which he swallowed instead. When Zeus reached adulthood, he got Kronos to vomit up all his children, whom were still alive in his stomach, and thus the Titan War began. I like the story of Kronos overthrowing Uranus as well. If I remember correctly, it involves Uranus being castrated by his children, the Titans, from inside his wife Gaia and his testicles being cast into the sea. The story of Orpheus, who was such a beautiful musician that he was able to use it to bargain for his wife's return from Hades. The only catch was he couldn't look at her the entire trip back or she would be pulled back in, which is exactly what happened when he looked back after exiting, but she wasn't fully out. I've always liked the version of Echo that I learned. Starts with Echo, a nymph, and Zeus totally banging, because Zeus bangs everything. He decides he wants to start banging some other girl, and he asks Echo to distract his wife Hera while he does so. Tells her she's got such a pretty voice it'll be easy. Echo starts hanging out with her and singing to her and stuff. Eventually Hera's like, the frick? Why is this bee hanging out with me so much? Then Hera finds out about Zeus's cheating, so she steals Echo's voice for helping Zeus deceive her. All Echo can do is repeat what other people say. So Echo runs into the woods and cries for 3 days straight until she hears this guy coming who's like the hottest guy ever. Desire to bone ensues, but she can't say anything cause she doesn't have a voice. It's Narcissus by the way, so he's staring at his reflection in the pond and Echo comes running out of the woods and hug tackles him and he's like, what the frick? Get off me, bee, and leaves Echo and she starts crying again and swears off men forever. Soon Pan shows up and is like, dude, she's so hot, I'm totally banging her. Pan teaches her how to play the flute and she gets super good at it and Pan gets jealous, but he's like, still must bang, until she rejects him since she hates men now. Then Pan's like, frick this bee, and tells his satyrs to straight up murder her. They do, and they get carried away and cut her up into pieces, then scatter her remains in all the caves of the world and that's why echoes are a thing. I read a more formal version and I must say, I find yours to be much better. 10/10 would recommend. How has no one mentioned Beowulf? He literally rips a monster's arm off, then beats the monster to death with their own arm. But he's not done. Then he tracks down the monster's mother and kills her too. After a 50-year break, he decides to slay a dragon using a sword and a wooden shield. They had metal shields and he thought, frick it, wood's good enough, a fire-breathing beast. What a complete badass. He also fought naked. Loki from Norse mythology tying one end of a rope to a goat and another around his balls and starting a game of tug-o-war. God dang it, Loki, that guy is freaking crazy. 411 BC, ancient Greece, the Lysistrata. Basically, the women of Greece are fed up with their husbands constantly at war with each other, so they withhold sex from their husbands until they can stop fighting. It works. Lysistrata is not a myth, technically, but rather fiction written by an identifiable individual, namely Aristophanes. Tiresias was a Greek dude who was walking through the woods one day. He happened to stumble across Athena bathing herself in a river. In her anger, Athena turned Tiresias into a woman. For 7 years, he wandered around as a woman before Athena came back to him in pity and undid her curse. Fast forward a little bit and one day Zeus and Hera are fighting with each other. Zeus had said that women enjoy sex more than men, and Hera insisted that men enjoyed it more. The only way to solve their squabble, of course, was to call upon that one dude Athena changed into a woman for 7 years. When Tiresias showed up, he said that women have better sex, thereby siding with Zeus. Obviously, Hera got pissed that she lost the argument, so she struck Tiresias blind. Zeus felt bad for him, because not only does his wife get the better sex but she's also a total B, so he gave him the gift of foresight and prophecy. He would have undone the blindness, but only the god who places a curse can undo it. Tiresias then later shows up to tell Oedipus that he'll bang his mom. That's really his only real contribution to anything, but he's got an awesome backstory. I'd love to spend a day as a woman, not sure about 7 years, though. The Greek myth of soulmates. It describes how humans were paired and had 4 appendages and 2 heads. Zeus was so afraid he split people into 2. That's why we go searching for our other half. Zeus has a headache. Has his head chopped open to see what the problem is. Athena pops out. Turns out his daughter was giving him a headache before she was even born. Well, he did stick her mother in there, pregnant. So Zeus goes off on one of his little excursions in which he single-handedly impregnates everyone, including at one point a shapely mound of dirt, and bangs a nymph named Maya. Maya gives birth, and the baby promptly wanders out of her cave, kills a turtle to make the first lyre ever out of its shell, and writes a song describing how great he is. Afterward, he decides it's time to make sacrifices to the gods, so he'd better steal something suitable from Apollo. Off he goes to capture a herd of cattle, which only lived in the sky up to this point, from the goddamn sun. To avoid being caught, he decides to strap bundles of sticks to his feet and leap home, taking 20-foot steps to throw Apollo off his trail. He slaughters a few cows and makes skewers to roast as a sacrifice. He makes 1 kebab for each god and 1 for himself, just to prove he's worthy of godhood. After all, only gods receive sacrifices and their names, right? That's day 1 of this little crap's life. He invents music to let everyone know how awesome he is, and steals from the fricking sun god. Day 2, Apollo notices his cows are gone, follows some weird butt tracks for miles to find a baby next to his cows, and figures that since no one else made the tracks, it must have been the tot. So Apollo whisks the kid off to Zeus to rat him out and charge him for his crime. The kid basically charms the pants off Zeus, talking his way out of trouble, and the king of the gods decides to make him his own personal herald. And upon hearing music for the first time, Apollo trades his anger for the instruments, and he and Hermes are chill for life. Long ago, when Zeus was once again bored, he saw a gorgeous woman as he looked down upon the city of Athens. He picked her as his next conquest, but, as she was married, he disguised himself as a bull and raped her when she was on her way back from getting the groceries. 9 months later, she gave birth to a child, and she and her husband agreed to call him Barbakos. Barbakos. Many mythology experts agree on the theory that it is a contraction of the words Varvarus and Orcus, meaning wild, manly man and house respectively. It is widely interpreted as manly man of the city. Hera, however, got jealous of her and decided to kill Barbakos' mother as revenge. When he was 14, Barbakos' father told him how he was conceived by a bull and that his mother died while giving birth to him. As a result, Barbakos grew a deep resentment for both the inside, as that is where his mother died, and bovine creatures, which were the cause of her death. No matter how often his father urged him to or invited him to come eat, Barbakos simply refused to go inside. After 3 weeks, he was so hungry that he had to invent something to be able to eat outside, and it had to be perfect for preparing cow. He grabbed a big earthwork bowl his neighbors had tossed out, fashioned a metal roaster from a few knives, threw in some charcoal and ignited it. It was the most glorious steak he had ever eaten, and soon, all of Athens came to his house, and a full-fledged feast began, which lasted 20 days and 20 nights. And that is the story of the invention of the barbecue. Now, there is also a story of his granddaughter Prometheus, but true barbecue know that gas barbecues are crap and you should never touch them. Thank you for that. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. Journey to the West featuring Sun Wukong, the monkey king who causes havoc in heaven after being tricked by the gods. He is then imprisoned by Buddha for 500 years until he is freed by a monk, who is on a pilgrim to the India to retrieve the Buddhist sutras. Dragon Ball Z is very loosely based on it. The League of Legends champion Wukong is loosely based on that guy as well. The Golden Apple. You've heard of the Trojan War, right? How Helen of Greece became Helen of Troy, the face that launched 1,000 ships. Well, here's how it started. All of the gods were having this party, but they decided not to invite. I think it was Ares. BC. She was a total bee and constant pot stirrer. Well, she found out, and to get her revenge, she threw a golden apple into the party with a note attached for the fairest. Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite all assumed it was for him. They argued and went whining to Zeus, who, wise god that he was, said no way am I judging this one. He elected Paris, of Troy, to make the decision. All 3 goddesses promised him gifts, and he settled for Aphrodite's promise of the fairest mortal on earth. Bam! Paris meets Helen. Double bam. Trojan War. Also, since I'm all about Latin and the Aeneid, there is an amazing article written that analyzes the imagery and symbolism used in Book 2, The Night Troy Fell. It's called The Serpent and the Flame, and it's pretty cool. The story of Hercules. He's the epitome of a demigod. He was flawed as a human can be, but an unquestionable god at the same time, as I doubt anyone can top the epic 12 labors. I've always enjoyed Hercules and Odysseus the most. Hercules was the perfect example of pure brute force, solving most problems with the sword, spear or arrow. Odysseus was almost the opposite, using cunning and guile above all else. Momos, the Greek god of writers, satire and criticism, spent the better part of an afternoon criticizing the gods. He criticized Zeus for his adulterous ways, Hephaestus for creating humans without windows in their chests to see what they're thinking, and even Aphrodite for having squeaky sandals. Momos was then banished from Mount Olympus. If I have a patron deity, it's Momos. Prometheus was chained to a mountain where every day an eagle would come peck his liver out. It would grow back just in time for the next eagle visit the following day. Diomedes, one of the greatest heroes of the Trojan War. Basically what happens when you combine Achilles' fighting skill with Odysseus' brains. In a duel with Aeneas, the son of Aphrodite, he manages to wound him by breaking his hip with a rock. Just as he's about to finish him off, Aphrodite swoops down to stop the fight. Enraged at this bulls, Diomedes chucks a spear at her in frustration that ends up piercing her wrist. Shocked, she flees with her son, and Diomedes is left standing there, fully aware that gods tend to take offense at this sort of thing. So Aphrodite convinces Ras, the god of war, to get revenge on Diomedes for her. Ras leads the Trojans and sends the Greeks running. Diomedes is trying to get himself and his troops the heck out of there when Athena appears to tell him to man the frick up. So as the entire army flees, Diomedes rides forward and, with a little nudge from Athena, pierces Ra's gut with a spear. Ras flees in horror and Athena swears to protect her new best friend for the rest of his life. Diomedes wounds a demigod and 2 Olympians and makes friends with another, all before lunch. Plato's Symposium. According to Greek mythology, humans were originally created with 4 arms, 4 legs and a head with 2 faces. Fearing their power, Zeus split them into 2 separate parts, condemning them to spend their lives in search of their other halves. When the earth was still flat, the clouds made of fire, and the mountains stretched up to the sky, sometimes higher. Folks roamed the earth like big rolling kegs. They had 2 sets of arms. They had 2 sets of legs. They had 2 faces peering out of one giant head, so they could watch all around them as they talked while they read, and they never knew nothing of love. I've been studying ancient Ireland and found the story of the children of Tuireann. The 3 sons of Tuireann killed the father of Lu, a deity and high king, and were sent on an epic quest by Lu as punishment to collect magical artifacts that would help him win a war against the Fomorians, demigods. It's a fascinating tale with all sorts of literary possibilities. The Epic of Gilgamesh is pretty interesting, if only because it's foreign, and the storytelling is archaic and primitive. I got a book for you mythology lovers. It's Michael Scott, The Adventures of the Immortal Nicholas Flamel. Basically, the author combines factual history with several different myths and famous characters to create the most epic storyline I have ever read. People such as William Shakespeare, Niccolo Machiavelli, and even Prometheus make debuts. I highly recommend it. Sekhmet, lioness-headed goddess of war, destruction, and having one's period. Anyways, her story goes that she fought for Ra, and after the victory, she didn't stop. Her rage and bloodlust almost took out the whole human race. They tricked her with wine, or pomegranate-dyed beer. She thought this was blood, and she got so wasted she passed out in the hot sun. Coolest aspect was the drunken festivals in ancient Egypt in her honor. Her cult was one of the longest lived, spanning close to 3,000 years. Tithonus. The dude was so attractive that he got a goddess to love him. She asked Zeus to give him immortality. Zeus granted her wish, but she forgot to ask for eternal youth as well. Tithonus gets older and older. Before long he is frail and calls out to his love every night. Tithonus turns into a grasshopper chirping at night. Hercules had slept with over 200 women, and those he married get fricked, figuratively, or frick him over. Also, he was essentially the Starbucks of Greek mythology. Like father, like son, I guess. My favorite story about ancient mythology is how my brother and his GF, now wife, were watching Xena, warrior princess at my parents' house one day. A commercial break came on, and my sister-in-law, who has never been accused of being a genius, had a very serious look on her face as she decided to announce, "You know, I don't really believe in Greek mythology." Both stunned and confused, I asked her, "What do you mean? Like you don't believe the Greek gods were real?" With a very satisfied look on her face, she nodded her head and declared, "Yeah, I don't think things happened the way they say it did, with Zeus and all of them. To this day, I'm still not sure who they are, besides possibly the writers of Xena, warrior princess." Any story involving Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, his wife, Aphrodite, is hot despite him being deformed. He's also the ultimate GGG compared to the other gods, but refuses to take their crap. From Wiki, Hephaestus was the only Olympian to have returned to Olympus after being exiled. In an archaic story, Hephaestus gained revenge against Hera for rejecting him by making her a magical golden throne, which, when she sat on it, did not allow her to stand up. The other gods begged Hephaestus to return to Olympus to let her go, but he refused, saying, "I have no mother." I guess this sort of counts, but I love The Frogs by Aristophanes. It's a comedy about Dionysus dressing up as Hercules to go into the underworld to save Euripides. He bewails the loss of great poets and thinks Euripides is the answer to all his woes. Along on the journey he brings his slave Xanthias, loaded with the supplies they need for the journey. Xanthias is just 2 coconut halves away from a role in a Monty Python film. Along the way they encounter various people and Dionysus pushes Xanthias into all sorts of horrible situations, but somehow Xanthias always ends up on top. An example of this is when they first arrive to the underworld and they run into Aeacus, who wants to kill Hercules over his theft of Cerberus. Dionysus forces Xanthias to swap clothes and they run into a maid and a bunch of virgins who are thrilled to see Hercules and want to party with him. Dionysus forces Xanthias to swap clothes again and, of course, They run into more people angry at Hercules and they swap clothes yet again. Cue Aeacus again. Dionysus thinks he has finally beaten the odds. Surely Aeacus will think Xanthias is Hercules and punish him. But no, Xanthias, who is wilier than his position would imply, offers up his slave Dionysus in his stead. The truth finally comes out as they're both whipped within an inch of their lives and everything just unfolds from there. When I first read it, I think I was most impressed by how their sense of humor seems so modern, I guess. I mean, at one point they even throw out the old "is there a doctor in the house" joke, breaking the fourth wall and speaking directly to the audience in character. There are a lot of great myths and plays, but I think this one is probably my favorite. It's also a really good analysis of people's tendency to think things like kids these days have such poor taste in music. It goes to show that this sort of thinking goes back a lot further than just a few generations. Any feelings about modern Christianity aside, the New Testament is really impressive. It's a story about radical love for your fellow humans, featuring a guy who didn't give a crap about authority, secular or religious, to the point of death. It's written in powerfully simple language, but at the same time filled with parable and metaphor that isn't entirely clear. It's a wonderful story, especially if you don't read it with modern Christianity in mind. It's a lot more open to interpretation than is generally acknowledged. Not nearly enough incest and bloodshed. Bring on the Greeks and Egyptians. Ragnarok, in which gods fight ice giants, all humans die except two. A giant wolf kills Odin. His granddad, a giant snake, tries to eat the planet but Thor kills it, and the sun dies but her kid takes over her job. Basically the most badass apocalypse ever. Of Orpheus and Eurydice. Eurydice died of a snake bite, so her husband, Orpheus, went to the underworld to try to bring her back. Hades agreed, but Orpheus couldn't look back at her until they got out. When they were about 3 steps away, Eurydice's footsteps got so faint that Orpheus could not hear them anymore. He turned around to look, resulting in his wife's drop back into the underworld. Good old Oedipus. Boy is cursed with the fate of killing his father and marrying his mother. They try to prevent this. He's left on a hill with braces through his feet. Eventually he leaves, ends up killing some guy on the street in a scuffle. It's his father. He ends up saving a city from a beast. The city is ruled by his mother. She loves him. They make frick and have children. Eventually the incest lovers find out. The mother kills herself and Oedipus stabs himself in the eyes, rendering him blind. He's cared for by his daughter sisters. Niobe. This lady, Niobe, has a butt ton of brats, the Niobids, and she decides to basically lord this over Leto, who only has 2 kids, the Lethaids, aka Artemis and Apollo. So the 2 of them take their bow and arrow and slaughter all of her brats, and people seem to be generally okay with this. From this we learn how Greeks react when you talk badly about their mothers. The end. I like the story of the Red Hand of Ulster, as seen on the flag of Ulster. Back in the day, the king of Ulster died without an heir to the throne, so Ulster was left without a ruler. It was decided that the best way to determine who should become king would be to hold a boat race. The first man to touch the shore of Ireland would become king. One of the men in the boat race realized that he was getting farther and farther behind, and there was no way he would be the first man to reach the shore. So he took out his sword, cut off his right hand, and chucked it toward the shore where it landed before the first man in the boats could touch it, and he became the king of Ulster. Some versions say that this was O'Neill. Dude really wanted to be king. TLDR. Guy wins boat race and crown by cutting off and throwing his own hand. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.